and more than a dozen wildfires are still raging across Spain. And amongst the hardest hit regions is the northwest province of Zamora, where 2 people were killed in those fires, Joseph Keane reports. Oh, excuse me. Sorry, there's a technical error with that report there. Well, for more on these extreme weather conditions, which climate scientists say is largely generated by global warming, Fanny Petitbon joins us. She is the head of advocacy at the humanitarian organization Care France. Thank you so much for coming on the show today, Fanny. So Emmanuel Macron will be traveling to southwestern France later in the day to assess the damage of those wildfires, as we've seen. How do you see his record on climate change over the past 5 years?
Well, honestly, Emmanuel Macron has not been the climate champion that he claims to be. What we saw is that France is still very far from actually fulfilling its objective to reduce greenhouse gas emissions reductions. It increased the threshold that it had set before. And France is still really, really behind when it comes to adapting the country. There's a recent report that came out which says that actually 2.3 billion euros should be allocated each year in France to adapt the country to global warming, because it is here. We can no longer ignore it. And Emmanuel Macron cannot just, make great slogans, can make great speeches. He really needs to get down to business.
Fanny, during his re-election campaign just months ago, he vowed to make climate change the centerpiece of his second mandate. And what you've seen and heard, and given these new reports, do you expect anything to change anytime soon?
Well, it will have to, in a sense, because the French state has been convicted twice last year by courts in France for its climate inaction. So judges have asked the state, which is now incarnated by Macron and his government, to take action and do much more and faster. So, of course, we will all be watching what President Macron will be saying this afternoon. But what we see now is, of course, there's a great effort in terms of trying to, extinguish all these fires. But what we need is actually investment on a longer term to prepare the French population for the heat waves, for the floods. Because it's important to know that in France right now, 6 out of 10 people are at risk of climate risks, whether it's heat waves, whether it's floodings, whether it's droughts. So a government, and especially a president, cannot ignore the needs and the risks that his population is facing.
More generally, Fanny, you've spoken in the past about how global leaders did indeed come together to impose major restrictions during the coronavirus pandemic. The suggestion, of course, being that something similar could be done to fight climate change. What actions concretely do you think that the government should take?
Well, that's very clear. If they listen to climate scientists, they will know what to do. What needs to happen between now and 2030 is that global greenhouse gas emissions must be reduced by 43% at least to make sure we stay on track of a 1.5 degrees global warming of a trajectory. So we cannot go above that limit, because above that, we will have consequences of climate change which we'll not be able to cope with. The second thing is to adapt. So to prepare, of course, the population. So, for example, renovate buildings, especially buildings that are hosting vulnerable populations, like elderly or young people, to make sure that these buildings, the temperature cannot go above a certain limit. Of course, it's investing in renewable energies and no longer fossil fuels. And what's really important is that governments in the global north need to support countries from the global south, which are right now experiencing, and actually for decades, the impacts of our climate inaction. And this is a climate injustice that also needs to be talked about, even though right now we're very much focused on what's happening in Europe. We cannot forget India. We cannot forget Pakistan. The heat waves that just happened, where actually birds were literally falling on the floor dead because of the heat waves. Dying because of a heat wave is no longer an expression. It is happening. So governments can no longer ignore it, and they need to take action.
Speaking of taking action, Fanny, the radical legislation that is required to really reduce those carbon emissions, as you explained, would certainly require major changes to the lifestyles that we've all gotten accustomed to. How willing, realistically, do you think that the French public is to accept the radical changes that are necessary?
Well, I think the French public is more and more ready to take this sort of actions that we've actually seen during the pandemic, that actually many people were ready to change their habits. I think now seeing climate change affecting the lives of everyone, like last night in Paris, we could feel the heat from the fires in Gironde. So this is everywhere, and I think the French people, and actually many people, are ready. It's just that the measures that need to be put in place must be accompanied by social measures to make sure that this transition is made in a way that people are supported. So, for example, when you ask people to renovate their buildings to make sure that it's energy is not going to leak out, you need to provide grants for them to do that. You cannot expect, especially poor, families, households, to do that on their own. If you want people to take more trains, buses, etc., you need to invest in the system, in the public transportation system, and you need to do all that. And for me, I think, and for CARE, what we think is that the French government emphasis on the responsibility of the individuals is actually quite hypocritical. If we want to change, we need structural changes. We need policies from the top of the government accompanied by social measures.
Fanny Petitbon, thank you very much for coming on the show today.
Thank you.